Thank you at home to joining us this hour. Happy to have you with us. We're going to start with something tonight that is a little bit off the beaten path, but there is a good reason for it, trust me. It starts with former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, who you may have noticed has become sort of an odd figure in politics these days, particularly in Republican politics these days, in this era of the Trump presidency. Chris Christie, of course, was thought of as being a strong contender for the Republican nomination in 2012, but he decided not to run in 2012. He did make a go for the Republican presidential nomination in 2016, but nothing really seemed to come together for him that year. He sputtered out earlier than people thought he would. He got only 2% of the vote in Iowa in 2016. He came in 6th place in New Hampshire, which is where he'd been really giving it his all. It just became clear pretty fast that there was no Republican appetite in 2016 for what he had to offer. And then, interesting decision, Chris Christie saw the writing on the wall earlier than the rest of the Republican presidential contenders did. And as he dropped out of the race, again, early on, he endorsed Donald Trump. And that was at a time when no prominent Republicans were fixing their cart to that particular horse. I mean, at the time Chris Christie plighted his troth with Donald Trump, he was alone. I mean, the closest Trump had to some other high-profile endorsement at that time was failed 2008 presidential candidate Rudy Giuliani admitting publicly that, yes, okay, he'd admit it, he sometimes spoke to Trump by phone. I mean, even Rudy Giuliani was not willing to endorse that guy at that point in 2016. But Christie came right out and did. And it was an unusual decision. And everybody assumed that maybe some of the political logic there was that Christie was gunning for the attorney general gig, or maybe even the vice president gig, or some other huge role in the Trump administration in the unlikely event that Donald Trump would win the presidency. Ultimately, Christie did get put in charge of building the Trump transition team, but only as long as they thought they wouldn't actually need it. They put Chris Christie in charge of the Trump transition in May 2016, fully 6 months before the election happened. Once Trump actually won the election and really did need a transition team, they took that job away from Chris Christie. They threw all his work out the window. It actually became sort of a triumphant Steve Bannon, Jared Kushner anecdote from the Trump campaign. That time right after they won, when they fired Chris Christie and literally threw in the trash can all the materials and all the planning that Christie had done to plan for the transition of power and setting up the new administration. He'd been doing the work on the transition for 6 months. As soon as they got in there, they fired him and got rid of all of his work. Oh, Chris Christie explicitly warned us against Mike Flynn being national security advisor. Christie says he wouldn't let General Flynn into the White House, let alone give him a job. Well, neener, we'll show that Chris Christie. We'll swear in Mike Flynn as national security advisor. Yeah, what could possibly go wrong? And would Christie himself get a top-tier job in the new Trump administration? Nope, no thanks. Thanks for that early, brave endorsement, though. Thanks for all your work that we reveled in telling the press that we threw out. Thanks for everything. Bye. Chris Christie does have a TV contract. He did write a book that says not one negative word about Donald Trump. In some other settings, he is occasionally mildly critical of the administration. But it's interesting. Mostly he is just unattached. This guy who was, definitely going to be a top-tier contender in 2012 had he run, who was in the top tier of national serious Republican politics for a decade, right? Now he's just like this little floating free radical out there who nobody has any link to, in a way that really is odd in this era. But if there's one thing that most explains why that is, why that worked out that way, it may be Bridgegate. Do you remember Bridgegate? I know it was years ago. But it turns out there is now a really interesting twist right at the end here. And you probably remember the basics of the story, right? Some of the first newspaper ink that was devoted to Bridgegate came in the form of a local traffic column in the Bergen Record in New Jersey. It was September 13th, 2013. The local traffic columnist wrote up a weird and unusually terrible week for commuters who were trying to drive from New Jersey to New York. This was the photo that ran with the story, and you can see, if you look closely, see there's a guy there standing in the middle of the traffic right next to the cones? It's not like he's a cop or anybody official. He's just a dude in khakis and a blue shirt standing to the side of his own car, just trying to figure out what it was that had completely stopped traffic, getting onto the nation's most heavily trafficked bridge, the George Washington Bridge, from the New Jersey town of Fort Lee toward New York City. The traffic was so stopped, you could park and get out of your car. The traffic was so stopped, it was completely stopped, not moving at all for hours and hours and hours. That column about the traffic jam on the bridge in Fort Lee, that ran on a Friday, but actually the traffic had been like that all week long. It had started on that Monday, it went on day after day that week. It not only stopped traffic onto the bridge, that traffic jam for traffic getting onto the bridge, it gridlocked all of the surface streets in the town of Fort Lee, New Jersey, in that whole town, with hundreds of cars backed up onto that town streets, all of them for hours with nowhere to go, not just during rush hour, but hours beyond, coming and going. And it was more than just a nuisance or a quirk. EMS response times ballooned as a result of that weird, unusual, and unnatural traffic. Paramedics were delayed in reaching an unconscious 91-year-old woman. That woman later died of cardiac arrest at the hospital. Emergency responders were late in getting to the home of a person who called 911 complaining of chest pains because of standstill traffic on Route 46 East in Fort Lee, New Jersey, traffic that was a result of the backup at the bridge. Among the people caught in the massive traffic jam were police who were assigned to look for a 4-year-old boy who had gone missing. That traffic jam had started on a Monday. That Monday was also the first day of school that year. And so on day one of the school year, school buses were late getting thousands of kids to school for their first day at school. And that was Monday, and then it went on like that all week with no relief whatsoever. Now, this might have been an unfortunate story about an inexplicable, unusually bad traffic jam, were it not for the fact that it became clear pretty quickly that it was man-made and apparently deliberately man-made. The Port Authority, which runs the bridge, put out a statement saying that the whole mess did not happen organically. It was the result of a traffic study. The problem was local officials who would be in a position to know if that were true said they weren't buying that. They don't think that's what actually happened. The police chief, for example, told the Bergen Record, quote, "It's not true." When the mayor of Fort Lee was asked about the situation, he responded by saying, quote, "I asked the Port Authority for an explanation, but they haven't responded. I thought we had a good relationship. Now I'm beginning to wonder if there's something I did wrong. Am I being sent some sort of message?" The Bergen Record and other New Jersey media outlets later obtained a flood of evidence showing that, in fact, this looked very much like the mayor of Fort Lee, New Jersey, was being sent some kind of message. That evidence included an email sent by Governor Christie's Deputy Chief of Staff, Bridgegate Kelly, on August 13th, 2013, about a month before the bridge closures. That email was sent by Bridgegate Kelly to one of Governor Chris Christie's top guys at the Port Authority, a guy named David Wildstein. David Wildstein was the Christie appointee who initially issued that bogus explanation that some sort of traffic study was to blame for the gridlock. Wildstein was the same Christie appointee who gave the orders to close those lanes onto that bridge, which caused the gridlock. Wildstein was the same political appointee who we later learned had given specific instructions to bridge employees not to warn the local police or the town of Fort Lee what was about to hit them in terms of this traffic Armageddon. But that email sent to him by Christie's Deputy Chief of Staff, Bridgegate Kelly, on August 13th, about a month before the lane closures, it said, quote, "Time for some traffic problems in Fort Lee." David Wildstein responded, "Got it." About 3 weeks later, on September 6th, David Wildstein called one of the Port Authority's directors to inform him that that coming Monday, these lane closures would take place on the bridge. That guy from the Port Authority said that was a very unusual call because traffic disruptions on major facilities like the George Washington Bridge, those things are typically planned years in advance. You wouldn't get notified, hey, this is going to happen on Monday. The George Washington Bridge manager says Wildstein instructed him not to tell anyone about it, not even Fort Lee police. When David Wildstein received information in response, when he was told in response that this was going to be a disaster, this was going to be a catastrophe, he shrugged off those warnings. He said we should go ahead. The warnings, of course, turned out to be spot on because, as designed, when the traffic lanes onto that bridge got shut down, everything in Fort Lee, New Jersey went straight to heck. As the chaos was taking hold, the mayor of Fort Lee started pleading by phone, by text, by email. He was contacting Bill Baroni, who was David Wildstein's boss at the Port Authority. He was another Chris Christie appointee. The mayor of Fort Lee and other officials were complaining about really serious stuff. They're complaining about ambulances being delayed and trying to get to people who are having heart attacks. I mean, email showed that the mayor and others were purposely met with, quote, radio silence. David Wildstein forwarded a complaint from the Fort Lee mayor to Bridget Ann Kelly over at Chris Christie's office. The mayor said he was frustrated that school buses couldn't get kids to their first day of school. Bridget Kelly's response, quote, is it wrong that I'm smiling? Wildstein's response, no, it's not wrong that you're smiling. Kelly, I feel badly about the kids, I guess. David Wildstein responds, quote, they are the children of Buono voters, meaning Barbara Buono, who is the Democratic candidate who was running against Chris Christie for governor when he ran for re-election that year. I mean, privately, all these messages were being sent back and forth about causing problems in that town of Fort Lee, about greeting their panicked cries for help with radio silence, about the pleasure these Christie staffers and appointees were taking in the pain they were causing the children of Democratic voters. That was what was happening privately. Publicly, the message was, oh, this is just a traffic study. Is it causing trouble? I mean, 2 months later, in November of that year, Bill Baroni, Christie's top appointee at the Port Authority, David Wildstein's boss, he ended up testifying before the State Assembly in New Jersey. It was a 2-hour performance. He tried to sell the legislature this cover story of what had really happened with the bridge. He tried to sell them that it had been a traffic study, even though that was a made-up cover story. Now, throughout all of this, Governor Christie and his top spokesman, Michael Druniak, they repeatedly said that Governor Christie didn't bother with decisions as trivial as traffic jams. The governor himself even joked about it.
I worked the cones, actually, Matt. Unbeknownst to everybody, I was actually the guy out there. I was in overalls and a hat, so I wasn't, but I actually was the guy working the cones out there. You really are not serious with that question.
After that, though, things started to unravel pretty quickly. A few days after Christie joked that he was the one out there working the cones, David Wildstein submitted his resignation from the Port Authority. A week after David Wildstein resigned from the Port Authority, Christie's other, even more senior appointee there, Bill Baroni, he also quit. And then those emails came out, including the one calling for some traffic problems in Fort Lee, at which point Governor Christie stopped joking around about it and got serious.
This morning, I've terminated the employment of Bridget Kelly, effective immediately. I've terminated her employment because she lied to me. I have not had any conversation with Bridget Kelly since the email came out. And so she was not given the opportunity to explain to me why she lied, because it was so obvious that she had. And I'm, quite frankly, not interested in the explanation at the moment.
I'm not interested in the explanation. But, you know, she sure as heck must have concocted this whole thing herself. During that same press conference, reporters pushed hard, right, asking questions as to whether this really was what it was starting to look like, whether this really was the governor's staff and appointees shutting down access to this huge bridge, the busiest bridge in the country, purposely gridlocking a whole town for days and days and days just to punish the Fort Lee mayor, Mark Sokolich, for his grave political crime of refusing to endorse Chris Christie in his re-election effort.
As I've said to you all many times before, Mayor Sokolich was never on my radar screen. I don't remember ever meeting Mayor Sokolich until I saw his picture last night on television. I wouldn't have been able to pick him out of a lineup.
I wouldn't have been able to pick him out of a lineup. Mind if I suggest that he's the one who should be in the lineup? even if you accept that the governor might not have been able to pick the Fort Lee mayor out of a lineup, his staff definitely could. Mayor Sokolich later told reporters that he had been courted for over 2 years to endorse Chris Christie for re-election. Heading into that November 2013 election, the Christie team was not just trying to get Christie to win. That was basically a foregone conclusion in New Jersey politics at that time. They were trying to run up the score. They were trying to get him as big an overall number in the election as possible, and specifically they wanted to get him as much crossover Democratic support as possible because they thought that would set him up well for a national presidential run in 2016. Wouldn't that be a great story to tell? Part of that strategy was to get mayors of New Jersey towns, particularly Democratic mayors, to publicly throw their support behind Chris Christie. Well, ahead of the Bridge Lane shutdown, Mayor Sokolich said that a member of the governor's Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, a young guy named Matt Mowers, would repeatedly meet with him and tell him about other Democrats who were endorsing Chris Christie. Quote, on at least 3 occasions, Mayor Sokolich said Mowers brought up the subject of Sokolich's possible endorsement. So clearly he was on their radar. And he was definitely on their radar during the lane closures, with Wildstein insisting that anything from the mayor complaining about what was happening to his town, any complaints should be greeted with, quote, radio silence. But beyond that, behind the scenes, everybody really seemed to be having a hoot at the mayor's expense. A few days after the closures, David Wildstein sent a press report about the traffic jam to Bill Stepien, who was Chris Christie's campaign manager at the time for his re-election effort. Mr. Stepien read it and wrote back, quote, it's fine, the mayor's an idiot. Wildstein later emailed Bill Stepien that, quote, it will be a tough November for this little Serbian. An apparent reference to Mayor Sokolich, even though he's not Serbian, he's of Croatian descent. And that's the sort of thing that people tend to mind, getting those ones screwed up. Just days after the Bridge Lane shutdown, Christie's spokesman, Michael Druniak, was fielding inquiries from reporters. When the Christie appointees at the Port Authority started to freak out to the press about it, we got more evidence how they felt about this whole thing. David Wildstein texted Bill Baroni, hey, the Wall Street Journal called my cell phone. Bill Baroni responds, Jesus. Less than a minute later, call Druniak. Call Governor Christie's spokesman. In the whole sea of emails and texts that were eventually uncovered in the scandal, we learned that the governor's spokesman, Michael Druniak, the governor's campaign manager, Bill Stepien, the governor's deputy chief of staff, that's Bridget Kelly, his top 2 appointees at the Port Authority, that's David Wildstein and Bill Baroni, another direct aide to the governor, Matt Mowers, his director of departmental relations, Christina Renna, the governor's then chief of staff, Kevin O'Dowd. They were all at least somewhat in the loop on this crisis while it was still underway and immediately thereafter. And yet, here was Christie in December.
There was nobody on my staff who had any knowledge of this issue until after the issue was already done.
Months later, Governor Christie's office would commission their own $1 million internal report to investigate the Bridgegate matter, get to the bottom of it. Taxpayers would pay. He'd have one of Rudy's best friends do it. That report had a very similar through line to the governor's press conference from back in January. I said December, but January. The one where he said that he had fired Bridget Kelly and that he was not interested in any of her explanations. That internal report commissioned by Christie's office was mostly greeted as a laughingstock, in part because it so emphatically cleared Governor Christie of everything and anything that you could have used it to recommend him for sainthood to the Vatican. It was also greeted as a laughingstock, frankly, because the report, I kid you not, went out of its way to blame the bridge scandal without explanation on purported difficulties in Bridget Kelly's love life, which I'm sure these guys enjoyed detailing in that report. But the relevance to the governor's scandal involving the bridge was quite hard to see. A New Jersey legislative committee also investigated. They decided they couldn't decide. They said they couldn't find conclusive evidence either way as to whether Christie knew about the lane closures in advance. A third investigation was a federal criminal investigation brought by the U.S. attorney in New Jersey. That investigation did not charge Governor Christie, but it wasn't exactly kind to him. In that investigation, David Wildstein pled guilty. He agreed to testify against Bill Baroni and Bridget Kelly. Baroni and Kelly were indicted. Federal prosecutors, again, weren't charging Christie at that trial. But they started the trial with what the New York Times called an unexpected and startling opening statement. They acknowledged right off the bat at the outset of the trial that Governor Chris Christie of New Jersey knew that 3 of his top officials were involved in a plan to shut down lanes leading to the George Washington Bridge as it was happening, and that the closings were intended to punish a local mayor for declining to support him. I mean, look at that page 1 headline in the New York Times. Chris Christie knew about bridge lane closings as they happened. U.S. asserts. Prosecutors say Christie knew of the bridge plot as it happened. Prosecutors said that David Wildstein and Bill Baroni had bragged to Governor Christie about the lane closings at a memorial service on 9/11. We had previously seen a photo of the 3 of them sort of yucking it up on September 11th at the World Trade Center. That was the 3rd day of the lane closures. During Wildstein's testimony, he said that he and Baroni were boasting to Governor Christie about how the lane closures had been done to mess with Mayor Sokolich in Fort Lee, and how the mayor's calls and texts were being deliberately ignored. Now, Baroni contested that on the stand, but Baroni was convicted at trial. Bridget Kelly was also convicted at trial. She testified for her part that she believed that the lane closures were part of a legitimate traffic study. And she testified that she told Christie about the plan on August 12th, a day before she sent that email calling for some traffic problems in Fort Lee. She testified that she told Christie in advance that the closures would cause tremendous traffic problems for Fort Lee. She says that Christie approved it anyway. She says she talked to Christie about the lane closures twice while they were underway, and that one of those times she even passed along that Mayor Sokolich had asked whether the traffic problems were being brought about as some sort of form of government retribution. Now, I should tell you that we reached out to Governor Christie for this story. He did not respond to us directly. He did issue a statement yesterday saying, quote, as I have said before, I had no knowledge of this scheme prior to or during these lane realignments and had no role in authorizing them. No credible evidence was ever presented to contradict that fact. Anything said to the contrary is simply untrue. He sent that statement generally yesterday. He sent it to us specifically today. Ahead of their sentencing, after Baroni and Kelly were convicted, prosecutors argued that neither Bill Baroni nor Bridget Kelly should be shown leniency because neither of them had been fully truthful on the stand. Well, now we're learning how this ends. And we're, it turns out, getting some twists in the plot at the very end. Bill Baroni got sentenced to 18 months behind bars in federal prison. He reported to prison earlier this month to start serving his sentence. Just yesterday, Bridget Ann Kelly was sentenced as well. She was sentenced to 13 months. She is appealing her conviction to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it is striking that all of the people apparently tangled up in this mess, of all of them, only 2 of them are going to prison. But what's even more striking is that some of them are not just avoiding prison, they're really thriving in the Trump era. Bill Stepien, Chris Christie's campaign manager, his name came up hundreds of times at the Bridgegate trial. He ran the overall effort for Christie's reelection effort to get all the Democratic mayors to endorse Christie. Wildstein testified that he told Bill Stepien all about the plan for Fort Lee and the bridge and why they were doing it, and even he told him about the whole traffic study cover story. He says he told Stepien about it all in advance. Christie cut ties with Bill Stepien when the scandal broke open. But Bill Stepien's doing great now. He was appointed White House political director for President Trump. He's now moved on to become a senior figure in the Trump reelection campaign. Matt Mowers, the guy who repeatedly pursued the Fort Lee mayor's endorsement until the mayor didn't bite and then he had to be punished. Matt Mowers ended up at the Trump State Department. He's now starting a consulting company and also plans to be working on the president's reelection effort. Ex-Governor Chris Christie, well, you know, he's floating around out there, doing okay. That said, this scandal has stuck to him a little bit, like a little TP on the shoe heel. But Bridget Kelly, she got sentenced yesterday. She is now about to report to federal prison, unless the president himself or the Supreme Court intervenes in her case. And now, she says there is something that you should know about this whole fiasco that you definitely haven't heard about before. Something that has not been any part of this news story before, but Bridget Kelly was just sentenced to federal prison yesterday. She is here tonight in studio and will join us here live. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.